It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Heidi Williams. Heidi is an assistant professor here in economics, so a little different flavor than we've had today here at MIT. She's also a faculty research fellow for the National Bureau of Economic Research. Her research is focused on understanding the causes and consequences of technologies in the healthcare markets. And today, in the era of Twitter and Facebook and quarterly earnings reports, is going to talk to us about what inventions we may be missing and how this may be important in long-term research. Heidi.
Thanks for sticking around for the end to hear the non-scientist wrap up the day. So I'm an economist by training. My research draws from science and medicine and law to essentially try to do detective work around the question, what inventions are we missing? And so when you go to conferences like this, you hear a lot about exciting technologies that are being developed. And what's harder, I think, is to think about if we were to design public policies differently, or if private firms had different incentives, what are the set of technologies that could be developed but aren't? And specifically what I have in mind is technologies that have a scientific feasibility, but never reach the market because of a lack of incentives. So if you take a specific question, so why don't we have more treatments for early stage cancers? A very natural answer that you get if you ask scientists or doctors is just the science is difficult. Maybe it's easier to treat late stage cancers, and that's why we have more treatments for those diseases, and just harder, the science is just harder in terms of finding treatments for early stage cancers. From an economic perspective, I want to think about the potential role for market incentives in explaining that outcome. And so one reason for that is just because when we say that the science is difficult, as I mentioned in the panel discussion before, the science being difficult partly reflects the amount of past research investments that have gone into an area by both private firms and by public research dollars or philanthropic research dollars. And so I don't want to take sort of the science being difficult as a fixed thing that couldn't be changed with different policy levers. And so the focus of my presentation today is going to be one specific research paper, which is joint work with Eric Budish at the Chicago Booth Business School and Ben Rowan, who is a lawyer at the MIT Sloan School. So the broad motivation for this paper was essentially an observation that you could get from reading the Wall Street Journal or just tracking drug approvals that come out of Food and Drug Administration, which is that over the last 5 years, there have been 8 new drugs approved to treat lung cancer. Almost all of them have been approved to treat very late-stage lung cancers that treat patients with a very advanced form of the disease, so metastatic cancer. Those drugs also tend to generate very incremental improvements in survival. And so one well-known example is Genentech's drug Avastin, which was shown to prolong survival, median survival from about 10 months to just over a year. And that was the first drug that actually pushed median survival over a year for this population. So in contrast, there's been no drug approved ever to prevent lung cancer. And in fact, some physicians did a catalog of all of the drugs that have ever been approved to prevent cancer, and there have been 6 case studies, which I'll, if I remember, come back to at the end. So why do we see that distribution of research that we see? Like I said, it could be because scientific challenges are actually just more difficult across different areas. But I'm going to walk you through an example of why I think there might be a lot more private incentives for firms to do research on late-stage cancer drugs relative to early-stage cancer drugs. So these are 2 examples of clinical trials for treatments for prostate cancer. The first is a clinical trial for metastatic prostate cancer patients. Their 5-year survival rate is about 20%. The second is a clinical trial for localized prostate cancer patients who have relatively better prospects. Their 5-year survival rate is about 80%. So both of these trials were published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2001, and they were randomized trials of treatments for these patient groups. So the first trial administered treatment and followed up survival in the treatment and control group, and they needed to follow up both groups for just over a year in order to have the statistical power that they needed to show a statistically significant difference in survival between the treatment and control group. Clinical trials don't just require that you show impacts on survival, they also require a lot of time for recruiting patients. And so taken together with patient recruiting and other time costs of the trial, the total trial lasted just about 3 years. The second trial for localized cancer patients needed about 9 years to show a statistically significant improvement in survival relative to the control group. And together with patient recruitment and other time, that total trial length was about 18 years. So that length in differences of the time of trials is just giving you some sense of what is the time cost, and if longer trials cost more, a difference in financial costs that are facing firms that want to develop drugs to treat these two different groups of patients. And so just the simple statistics of how you do clinical trials tells you that if you have a randomized trial and you want to show the impact on survival for groups that are going to live longer or have better survival prospects, you're going to need a longer trial. So the goal of these two examples is not to be representative, it's just to say that those differences are actually quite large. The second factor that we investigated in our research, which could compound these differences in the time required to do trials, is the structure of the patent system. And so there's very, very strong incentives in the private market to patent your drug before you start clinical trials. And so what that means is that for every day that your drug is in trial, that's one fewer days that you actually have an effective patent where you're able to charge some above competitive market price when you're actually selling your drugs to patients. And so the way that we've structured the incentives in the patent system is actually to provide more incentive for firms to come in and develop drugs that have shorter clinical trial periods because we give them a longer effective patent term. And so, in this case, if all patent terms are 20 years and the only research involved post-patent filing were these trials, the first drug would get 17 years of effective patent life, whereas the second would get 2 years. And so the patent system is not the only reason pushing private incentives more towards developing drugs to treat these late-stage cancers relative to early-stage cancers, but it's a specific way in which the policies that we provide as a society are giving more rewards for certain types of inventions and not others. And so consistent with these differences in what I'll call commercialization lags, so the lag required to develop new drugs, consistent with commercialization lags having a big impact on private incentives, this first trial was privately funded, whereas the second trial was publicly funded. And so one of the things I'll talk about in our research is we put together data on public and private research funding to try to ask whether the public sector was doing something different in terms of which projects it chooses to fund. So the first thing we wanted to do was just to document some facts on what is the distribution of research funding across different types of cancers. And so if you think of cancers as, maybe there's 80 cancer types and there's 3 different stages, localized, regional, and metastatic. You have about 200 data points. This is a graph where I've collapsed all of that data to about 3 data points. So the x-axis is just the 5-year survival rate for the major stages of cancer, metastatic, regional, and localized. The y-axis is the number of clinical trials that patients of those stages were eligible to participate in the data that we have, which is all of the National Cancer Institute registry clinical trials. So it turns out that just documenting this fact sort of required putting together some new data, which is basically drawn from advertisements for clinical trials. So if you want to know for patients of different types of cancers, how much research is going on those patients, it's hard to measure that using things like publications or patents, because patents often don't clarify, this is a drug that's in development for metastatic colorectal cancer or localized breast cancer. And so it's just not labeled in a way that very naturally matches patient groups to research investments. And so instead what we started with is essentially calls for enrollment in clinical trials, where firms and the public sector reveal which patient groups are eligible to enroll in their trials. And so that gives a very specific way of saying, here's a research investment that was targeting this specific group of patients. And so if we look in that data on clinical trials, you can see that metastatic cancer patients were eligible to enroll in about 12,000 trials in our data, whereas localized cancer patients who are relatively healthier were eligible to enroll in about 6,000 trials. This data is roughly from 1970 to 2005, you can say. So the 5-year survival rate is very different across those stage groups. So for metastatic cancer, on average, the 5-year survival rate is about 10%, as opposed to for localized cancer, it's more like 70%. So those differences in 5-year survival rates, in the same way that I talked about in the example in the last slide, translate into big differences in clinical trial lengths. And so one hypothesis is maybe this decline in the amount of research that's going on in these earlier stage cancers is because of these private incentives that I'm talking about. But this picture on its own is not very convincing in telling that story for two reasons. So the first is that's just a correlation between the 5-year survival rate and the amount of research investment. That doesn't necessarily reflect a causal relationship where if we had shorter clinical trials, would we get more investment? The second thing is, even if there is a causal relationship where if we had shorter clinical trials, we would get more research investment, that doesn't mean that there's a distortion in what private firms are doing relative to what we would want as a society. Because if clinical trials were shorter, the NCI would also want to fund a lot more clinical trials because they would just be cheaper. And so if we want to really say that there's what economists would call a market failure or a distortion where private firms are actually doing something that's different from what society would want if we owned the firm or if we ran the firm, you want to show that there's a difference where the public sector is doing something different than what the private sector would do. And so for this paper, what we did is we tried to put together two analyses to try to essentially build this argument to address each of these two points. So the first point that we try to make is if we did have shorter clinical trials, would we get more drugs developed? And so this is in one graph, sort of our attempt to communicate the results of that test to you. So it turns out there's a subset of cancers, which are leukemias and lymphomas, so hematologic cancers, which for a long time that have been allowed to get drugs approved by the US Food and Drug Administration, not on the basis that those drugs improve survival, but rather on the basis that they improved markers that are thought to be good predictors of subsequent improvements in survival. And so showing that a drug reduces the amount of cancer in your bone marrow or in your blood for these cancers is a very good predictor of you're going to have an improvement in your survival later. And so the reason why we migrated to this was not to advocate for using surrogate endpoints, because they're very controversial and it's hard to find good, valid surrogates. But what we wanted was a source of variation in the data that essentially implemented the thought experiment that we had in mind of if we did have shorter clinical trials, would we see more investment? And so what I've plotted in this figure are each of the 200 data points that I mentioned. So each data point is a cancer stage observation. And in gray are sort of all of the non-hematologic cancers. So one dot would be localized breast cancer, and another would be metastatic pancreatic cancer. The red dots are the hematologic cancers, which, like I said, are allowed to use these surrogate endpoints, which should break the relationship between 5-year survival being a predictor of how long it takes to develop new drugs. Because you don't need to show impacts on survival. You can show impacts on these endpoints that can be shown much more quickly. And so what you see with the gray line and the linear fit line is that, as suggested by the stage level graph, we get more investment in clinical trials, in drugs to treat patients that have shorter life expectancies as measured by having lower 5-year survival rates relative to longer 5-year survival rates. But for the hematologic cancers, we actually see a very different pattern where, if anything, that line slopes slightly upwards. Statistically, you can't distinguish that it's just a flat line. So there's no relationship between the 5-year survival rate and the amount of investment that we see in drugs to treat those different groups of patients. And so what's sort of the goal of this graph? So there's a lot of reasons why you might think that we get less research on early stage cancers because, for example, patients are just healthier and maybe they're less likely to want to get treated with chemotherapy, which has a lot of bad side effects. So to the extent that patient demand is just different, that would be one reason why you could see a correlation between the 5-year survival rate and the amount of research. Similarly, healthier patients may be less willing to enroll in clinical trials. And so that's another reason why you could see less research on these sort of better survival rate cancers. But the difference between these two lines is telling you that for the same 5-year survival rate, it looks like we're much more able to successfully recruit patients, and patients have a demand for getting treated when the trials are shorter. So the data doesn't look consistent with this relationship being driven by unobserved factors. It really looks like when we allow firms to use these endpoints, which allow for shorter clinical trials, we do get an increase in private investment. And we have some analogous results, which I'm not showing today, that this incremental increase in research investment that you see when you allow for shorter clinical trials seems to translate into improved survival for patients. And so what that means is that the marginal drugs, so the drugs that are developed because the clinical trials were shorter, seem to have social value in the sense that they are generating survival gains for patients. And so that's somewhat embarrassingly like a novel finding in this area, because it's hard to show causal evidence that drugs improve survival sort of outside of clinical trial settings. But we find evidence here that's very consistent with, if we had shorter trials, we would not just get more drugs developed, but they would be drugs that were actually bringing substantively large benefits to patients. The second analysis that we put together was contrasting privately funded R&D and publicly funded R&D. So we don't have perfect data on trial sponsorship, but what we can say is that the relative share of trials that are privately financed is higher for these shorter trials. And what that means is that when you get to these very long trials, consistent with part of the discussion that was on the panel today, public funding is a much more important variable in terms of who's willing to fund those trials. And what that suggests to me is that it's not that there aren't scientific opportunities available for these large-scale trials to be run, or that patients aren't willing to enroll them. It's just that private firms aren't willing to run these trials, and the public sector is sort of able to step in and do some funding when the private sector is unwilling to do so. So we do an analysis of different policy levers that you could use to try to address this distortion. So there's two things that our work can speak to directly. One is, if we had valid surrogate endpoints, it looks, based on this case study, like allowing firms to use those would encourage more private research investment and would generate health gains to patients. That's not to say that we have any expertise as economists on where to find more valid surrogates, and that I'll come back to in the next slide. The second thing that our research can speak to directly is pinpointing areas where public research subsidies would be most valuable. And so, the pithy summary of this would be, the NCI's research dollars look like they would be less valuably targeted to late-stage cancer treatments relative to early-stage cancer treatments or cancer prevention, where we know that there's going to be this gap between private research dollars and the social value of those investments. And so it's providing some guidance on where to target scarce public funds. What our estimates can't do is speak directly to the importance of patents in generating this distortion, because that's just not something that we have direct variation in our data to be able to speak to. So what I want to end with, after talking about sort of the data that we collected and the empirical tests we did, which, if anyone's interested, I can send you, the 80-page paper that we wrote on this. Instead, I just want to end with an anecdote, which I think is illustrative of why this could actually be very important. And so, if you look at heart disease, which is the leading cause of death in the US, the age-adjusted rate of death from heart disease has dropped by over 50% since 1968. And so David Cutler, who's an economist at Harvard, has some work with Srikanth Kadiyala trying to decompose what do we think drove that decline in cardiovascular mortality. And they basically say that a large share of that decline should be attributed to drugs like beta blockers and ACE inhibitors and statins. And so if you look at what were those drugs approved on the basis of, they were largely approved on the basis of lowering blood pressure and lowering LDL cholesterol levels, not on the basis that they actually reduced cardiovascular disease mortality. And so there's obviously been a lot of controversy over whether those are valid surrogates, but for the purpose of this exercise, I just want to talk about the history of where the idea for looking at those as surrogates came from, which was from the Framingham Heart Study. And so this was this large, decade-long, federally funded study that just documented blood pressure and high cholesterol as being risk factors for cardiovascular disease, which then spurred some subsequent studies to try to validate, is it just that those are correlates of cardiovascular disease, or is it actually that those are valid surrogate endpoints? And so many people have argued that without these surrogate endpoints, some of these drugs wouldn't have been brought to market. And with an anecdote or an example, it's impossible to make statements like that. But our evidence for cancer is consistent with, in this case for cancer where we had valid surrogates, it looks like they did have a real impact on which drugs successfully reach patients. And so I would say that our evidence, together with these kinds of case studies that you can get from looking at the historical record, both suggest that research investments that are aimed at investigating and validating surrogate endpoints could potentially have a very large social return in leveraging private investment and trying to get new drugs that are scientifically feasible but not being brought to market to actually reach patients. And as I stressed during the panel discussion, I think this is a very natural area where publicly funded research dollars to validate these surrogate endpoints is going to be really critical, because no private firm has it in their interest to come in and do a validation study of a given surrogate that then every firm in the market is going to get to use. And so it's really a place where there's a very natural economic rationale for the public sector coming in and providing this specific form of investment in a very targeted way. And so that's just to give you some flavor of the type of things that I'm working on. And if people have questions, please feel free to follow up with me. But thank you for the opportunity to talk with you.